The deep-sea submersible descended through the midnight zone of the Pacific, 3,000 meters below the surface where no sunlight had ever penetrated. Inside the titanium sphere, Dr. Elena Voss watched the sonar screens with growing unease. The mission was routine: hydrothermal vent sampling, microbial extremophiles, standard oceanographic work. The kind of research that kept grant money flowing and publications in peer-reviewed journals. But the sonar had stopped showing what it should have shown. Instead of the scattered, chaotic pings of the seabed topography she knew so well, there was a rectangle. Perfect. Geometric. Impossibly straight edges meeting at right angles that nature never built. The sub's computer ran the data 3 times before anyone dared to say it out loud. "It's a mile long," said Chun, the sonar technician, his voice tight. "At least. And it's sitting 200 meters below the vent field. There's nothing in the geological survey that predicts this. Nothing at all." Elena pressed her palm against the cold viewport. Somewhere below them in the black water lay something that did not belong to the ocean floor. The descent to 2,000 meters took 40 minutes. Every 100 meters the water pressure outside climbed, the hull groaned softly, and the sub's external lights failed to illuminate more than 20 meters into the void. Elena kept one hand on the comms while the other hovered over the depth gauge. Then the lights found it. The structure was exactly as the sonar had promised: vast, smooth, and perfectly rectangular. It rose from the sediment like a wall dropped by a titan. No weathering, no coral growth. Its surface was covered in crystalline formations that caught the sub's beams and threw back a faint bioluminescent glow, pale blue and sickly green, as if the stone itself had been dreaming. "It's not basalt," whispered Kowalski, the geologist, leaning so close to his window his breath fogged the glass. "It's not granite. It's not any formation I've ever seen. It's machine-made," Elena finished. They all heard the truth in her voice. The structure did not look built. It looked extruded. The crystalline growths pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like cold hearts beating deep in the stone. The sub moved along the outer face for another hour, mapping impossible angles and surfaces that defied sonar categorization. Then they found it, a doorway. Not a crack, not a fissure. A deliberate aperture, 10 meters tall, framed by metal that should have been frozen solid at these temperatures, but was warm to the touch when Elena observed it through the external thermal sensors. "Symbols," said Rao, the linguist, leaning in, etched around the frame. Curvilinear. No relation to any known script. Not Sumerian, not Indus, not anything in the Unicode database. The metal of the door itself was dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Symbols spiraled outward like roots, deeper than any carving, as if the door had grown around them rather than been inscribed. When Elena zoomed the camera feed, she saw that the metal was changing, microscopic shifts, almost too slow for human perception, but the time-lapse overlay made it clear. The door was breathing. Something went wrong at the seal study. A pressure valve stuck. A thruster misfired. The sub's portside manipulator arm swung wide and struck the door's outer frame with a ringing impact that vibrated through the hull. The metal groaned, not under the force of the blow, from inside. The sub pinged backward automatically, thrusters flaring, as a hairline fracture appeared in the seal. Bioluminescent clouds erupted from the crack, rolling upward in slow, deliberate tendrils of blue-green light. The sub's cabin temperature dropped 3 degrees in seconds. "Get us back," Elena ordered. "It's pulling," Chin said, fighting the controls. "Something below us is generating an updraft. Not thermal, not hydrothermal." The door behind them opened another centimeter. From the darkness beyond came a sound like distant bells ringing underwater. The sub rose shakily, dragged by an ancient current that did not care about their engines, their mission, or their lives. The breach was big enough. The sub slipped through into a chamber so vast that Edward's light cones died before they touched the far wall. Here the cold had a weight. Here the silence was so complete that Elena could hear the blood rushing in her ears over the hum of the life support. Structures rose from the floor. They looked architectural: pillars, archways, vaulted ceilings, but wrong. Organic. The stone had been grown rather than carved, shaped by pressure and intent rather than tools. Veins of bioluminescence ran between the structures like nervous systems. In places the walls had faces, smoothed by millennia of deep pressure, their expressions frozen in geometries that were almost, but not quite, human. They were inside something that had been dreaming for longer than humanity had existed. They navigated the sub toward the nearest light source, following a corridor that widened into a garden. Gardens of crystalline growth stood in rows, each pulse synchronized to a rhythm deeper than any heart. The formations were beautiful and obscene. Mineral flowers with petals of glass, stalks that bent and flexed with the slow certainty of living things, roots that disappeared into stone so hard the drill could not sample it. Some crystals held faces, not sculpted faces, morphogenetic accidents, faces that had emerged from the mineral like memories surfacing from trauma. Their expressions twisted between sorrow and hunger and loneliness. One of the crew, younger than the rest, stared at one too long. He vomited quietly into his helmet and whispered that he had seen this architecture before. "In my dreams," he said, "since I was a boy." The lab lights failed first. Then the external floodlights died one by one. In the sudden darkness, something moved, vast, segmented, covered in eyes that reflected what little light remained. It filled the chamber with a presence that had weight. It was not fast. It was simply everywhere at once, because the darkness belonged to it. When the emergency strobes kicked in, the sub's cabin filled with dancing shadows. The creature was closer now, pressed against the viewport, its many eyes studying the interior the way a child studies an aquarium. It did not strike. It did not demand. It watched with an intelligence that made the crew feel small and transparent. The youngest crew member saw it clearly. He did not scream. He simply folded inward, his breathing slowing, his eyes staring at nothing, as his mind rearranged itself around geometries that were not meant for human brains. Back at the comm station, Elena found a folder of corrupted audio files buried in the sub's database under a 1952 Arctic expedition log. The language was nearly dead, reconstructed phonetics from a culture that had disappeared 70 years ago. Raised volume, trembling voices, then a door opening. "The sleepers," the recording said. "The necessity of sealing forever." The speakers spoke of a structure not built, but grown. Of a door that should never be opened. Of an intelligence so old and so far from human understanding that they had decided it was safer buried than known. The log ended with the sound of the door sealing, a mechanical grinding that faded into the bioluminescent hum Elena had already learned to recognize. Historical records were thin but unanimous. The 1952 expedition had never resurfaced. Their ship, the HMS Dagon, was officially decommissioned 2 months after the mission. Their families received censored letters. Their data was classified under an act that no longer existed on any public registry. Someone in the chain of command had decided the ocean floor should keep it secret. All equipment destroyed. Coordinates scrubbed. A lie spread that the day the creature returned. It hovered outside the sub, its many limbs drifting weightlessly in the surrounding water. When Elena flooded the external lights, it responded differently than before, intentionally. Using the beam as a surface, it drew symbols in the sediment below. Elena recognized them immediately. The same script etched into the door. It drew a line, then another crossing it to form a triangle, then a circle inside. Symbols on the door matched the symbols in the sediment matched the symbols in the 1952 log. The meaning assembled itself with terrible clarity, a countdown. The creature was not attacking. It was warning. The chamber beyond was opening. Led by the bioluminescent guide, the sub entered a chamber larger than any cathedral. In the center, on an altar of black glass, rested a form so large that the sub's floodlights could not capture it whole. It was prone, its many limbs folded inward, its breathing so slow that the chamber's atmosphere cycled with it. Where its skin touched the air, the bioluminescence intensified, painting the walls with patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It's not waking," Elena whispered. "It's already half awake." The 1952 team had mined radioactive material into this chamber as a last resort. The radiation had kept the entity dormant, slowed its metabolism to geological time. But the isotope they had used decayed. The readings were clear. Within decades, perhaps years, the dose would be insufficient. Deep in the sub's archives, Elena found ancient translations, scholarly papers on the civilization that had imprisoned the deep god. They were not primitive. They were advanced, advanced enough to know that some things cannot be fought, only delayed. They built the seal not to protect themselves, but to protect humanity. The text spoke of a time when the seal would need renewal. They predicted that their technology would fail. They left instructions in symbols that matched the door, in stories that matched the dreaming faces in the garden, in a warning that matched the bioluminescent countdown. The prophecy was not a riddle. It was an apology. Elena downloaded the 1952 team's final sensor logs. The data was fragmented, corrupted by decades of salt water, but the signatures were unmistakable. The team had not perished in the sealing. They had sealed themselves inside the lower chambers with enough radioactive material to render the area uninhabitable for centuries. They had chosen to become the deterrent. The radiation was decaying. The lower chambers were warm. The Queen was stirring. The compromise was failing. Elena understood then why the records were classified, why the site had been abandoned, why every lead had been systematically erased. Someone had known. Every government since 1952 had known. And every government had chosen to let the clock run out, hoping they would not be in office when the countdown reached zero. The ascent was a negotiation. The creature guided them through corridors that narrowed and opened with organic precision. At each junction it paused, waited, then moved when their lights confirmed they were following. It did not hinder them. It did not demand anything. It simply accompanied them, as if their leaving mattered to it. Elena watched it in the external monitors. Its eyes tracked the sub's movements. When the hull vibrated with the passage, it adjusted its limbs to create clearance. It was not hostile. It was waiting. And in its movements was a grief so old and so vast that Elena felt it in her chest before she understood what she was feeling. The sub breached the surface just as the inner seal cracked fully. Behind them, the ocean boiled with bioluminescence. Authorities were waiting. Not the welcoming committee they had expected, scientists with cameras and relief, but military vessels with weapons trained on their hull. Black helicopters circled above. An encrypted channel opened on their comms, demanding silence under threat of lethal force. Elena watched through the viewport as classified markings appeared on the sides of the ships. She recognized the insignia. She had seen it in the 1952 files. The same organization that had buried the truth 70 years ago had been waiting for someone to resurface. They broadcast a single message: confirm your silence or be denied access to the surface. Elena flipped the switch. The sub's exterior cameras went dark. Elena sat in a secure facility, surrounded by screens that showed the same news reports playing across every network. Strange seismic activity in the Pacific. Unexplained radiation spikes. Government spokespeople denying everything while military assets moved toward coordinates that did not exist on any public map. She had been given a choice. Blow the structure off the map with a tactical device. Ensure that the sleeper never woke. Ensure that the loneliness below remained entombed in stone. Or let it rise, let the intelligence speak. Let the world discover that the monster was only waiting to be acknowledged. Elena watched the clock count down in her private terminal. Outside, the ocean surface shimmered with bioluminescent light that had no business being there. She reached for the phone, then stopped. Through the reinforced glass of the observation room, something outside the building moved. A limb, vast and translucent, pressed against the glass from the other side. It dripped with bioluminescent fluid that painted the room in shifting blues and greens. The hand waited. It did not demand entry. It simply waited, as it had waited for centuries, for someone to acknowledge that it was there. Elena lifted her hand and pressed her palm against the glass from the inside. The light outside brightened. The countdown on her terminal reached zero.